Well, howdy, folks. It's your host, Lee Larson. You're back with another week of Follow the Leader. I am here with the outdoor minimalist, Meg Carney. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat. I know we have a lot to cover.
It's um and that's exactly what I was drawn to you. You are the lead of Outdoor Minimalist podcast. You have also started Black-Footed Ferret Productions. You've been featured in National Geographic and Outside Magazine, and you consider yourself an outdoor journalist. You are helping both normal people and companies work towards a more clean, minimal, environmentally friendly world. Tell us how do you even get into that? That is, thank you for all you do. How did that journey start?
It is unconventional, I will say that. But I did go to university for communication arts and literature, so it kind of falls into that realm. I didn't study journalism in any capacity, and I worked in the outdoor industry for most of my 20s, but continued writing during that time. But I can back up a little bit to kind of like where I grew up. I grew up in a rural part of Minnesota down in the southwest corner, which is prairie land, so it's the Great Plains. And we grew up on about 400 acres of land that has an easement, so it's designated for conservation. And my grandfather was a conservationist, and I spent a lot of time with him during my childhood. Once we moved off of the farm, my parents actually opened a bookstore that was connected to our house. And so I lived in a bookstore and kind of went between the farmland and reading all the time. So it's just kind of like a natural progression of the things that I was raised with and was most interested in. But I kind of had to find my way back to those things in my 20s because I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. And so I started out guiding in outdoor spaces, did some like wilderness survival stuff, rock climbing, etc. But I kept writing that whole time because my entire life I've always liked to write. And it's just, I've kept a journal. I like to write short stories and fiction and also read, of course. But then through that time period in my 20s, I spent a lot of it living out of my vehicle. I still do that on and off because I am quite nomadic. And I started to realize in the spaces that I was, which mostly the rock climbing industry, but other ones as well, like backpacking, there wasn't a lot of focus on zero waste or sustainability or minimalism, right? This is probably over 10 years ago, so it's different now. But when I started to enter the outdoor writing space, that was not a topic that people really ever covered. And I had a hard time finding jobs that wanted me to talk about it. And so I started my own blog, which is no longer up and running. I started that, and I don't know when did I start that? Probably like 2018-19 era. Roman and Littlefield, which is the publishing company that published Outdoor Minimalist, they reached out to me and asked if I was interested in writing a guide on zero waste backpacking. And I was like, that's interesting. I don't really believe that zero waste is that inclusive of a term. And so I try not to use it that often. And so I pitched to the publishing board the idea for Outdoor Minimalist, and they liked it. They thought that it kind of appealed to a wider audience. And so that's how that was born. And that happened during COVID. So I think I got the deal at the beginning of 2020, like January. And so it was in the middle of the pandemic. Perfect pandemic project, I will say.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It did delay with the supply chain delays. It delayed production of the book because I wrote it in about 3 months. And of course, we had edits and stuff, but we weren't able to publish it for over a year because of the supply chain lags and the fact that I was very specific on needing it printed on recycled paper. It needed to be FSC, like all these things. And they were very accommodating. So I appreciate that about that publisher. They
Wow.
are no longer, they've been acquired by Bloomsbury, in case people look them up. But um, I'm trying to think how long after the book was completed. So I completed it in 2020 in the spring. And then I was like, well, this has been my life for the last like 3-4 months. I don't really know what I'm doing. I was still freelance writing. And then my brother was like, have you ever thought about doing a podcast? is the publisher and the editors, they really wanted the book to be consumer facing, like a handbook someone could pick up, an average person. And I wanted it to be more industry focused. So it'd be for
Mm.
industry professionals. And he's like, that way you could broaden kind of the topics that you wanted to talk about in the first place. And so I was like, that doesn't seem like a good fit for my personality, but I'll always try something, see if it works out. If it doesn't work out, then I'll just move on. And it turns out that audio is my favorite. So I'm really glad that I tried it. And I'm really into audio journalism now. And I still write and do freelancing and all that stuff. But I would say like the bulk of my time is spent producing the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, working on other projects with other people. And also, was it last year? It seems so long ago. No, because it's 2026. So in 2024, we also produced the Forever Chemicals podcast, which is a 10-part miniseries with one bonus episode that covers the use of PFAS or forever chemicals in the outdoor industry.
Thank you for taking a risk and then sharing your information with folks like me um, that love the outdoors, but maybe there's a better way of being out and enjoying them. Maybe there's a more sustainable way. Um, I know that you have said that you are nomadic, which you were raised in the Great Plains of Minnesota and you've moved around quite a bit. That's a lot of different ecosystems. How has that helped shape the way you see the United States and sustainability? Are there um, different? Yeah, that's how has seeing all these different ecosystems impacted how you advocate?
That's an interesting question. I guess it's one that I haven't thought about in too much depth, but I think that it brings a lot of diversity, and there's pros and cons to it. If you live a nomadic life, you sometimes lack community in the physical sense. But it has opened up a lot of doors for me in terms of like seeing other people's lifestyles because I grew up in a rural community. And so I'm very used to like that farming community, like helping your neighbor, that sort of thing. But going around and seeing different lifestyles like in and out of cities and more impoverished areas, more upscale areas. The United States is so diverse. And I think sometimes we can get like stuck in our little bubble. And even the outdoor communities in other areas are very diverse in like how they approach problems and the things that they care most about. And so I think it just brings a different perspective and kind of like broadens my worldview. I know that it's only one country, but sometimes when I've gone like state to state, it can feel like you're entering different countries completely. Like if you compare something like New York to Texas, you know? And I think, I don't know if this is answering your question at all. I'm just kind of like thinking about it, but it has helped me understand people's motivations, I guess, and kind of meet people where they are when I am deciding to talk about these things because other writers and journalists, anyone who works in media will probably feel this way to some capacity that when you're talking about a topic and you're studying it in depth. So if we use the Forever Chemicals podcast as an example, like I worked on that production for over 6 months. And so I know a lot about it, but there are people who have never even heard the term forever chemicals. And that is always shocking to me because I'm like, what do you mean? But that happens with all topics, So it's just, it's eye opening and it's always interesting to meet new people. And I always learn from everywhere that I go. So.
And there's such a relationship, obviously, with the people and the land, whether it's recreating in the land, recreating in the public spaces that we have. Um, However, that's also will always be a point of contention because it's where we get our resources. So whether it's mining or it's AI or logging, oh my gosh, up here in Montana, there's always going to be tension when you have gone in and to do these advocacy projects, whether it's black-footed ferret production or otherwise, have you ever gotten pushback, protester, or felt, yeah, pushback.
Yeah, I mean, there's always journalist is a loaded term. I would say by and large, people don't favor journalists. It's similar to lawyers. It kind of depends on their personal perception of the profession. But what I found is most of the time, when you start talking to people and you're asking them questions and you're trying to relate to them, you're able to show them that you have more in common than you don't. And of course, there's always going to be people who don't want to talk to me, and I respect that. I can be very persistent, especially when I'm talking to industry leaders and companies. But when it comes to individuals, I haven't really experienced too much pushback. There's always going to be spaces where I'm not welcome simply because I do ask a lot of questions, and industry leaders don't always like that. So the most pushback that I've experienced is actually within the outdoor industry itself, not necessarily when I'm talking to community members, because a lot of times community members, they want their story to be heard and they want it to be seen. They want to feel validated in their experience. And so they're less PR focused, I guess.
Um, and when that's exactly like the common public doesn't know, we don't have the right, we want to do the right thing. And there's so much information out there. And that doesn't surprise me that folks in the industry are some of your biggest hurdles. They're not interested in changing what's already going on, and they're not interested in changing what's profitable. Um, There has been a lot of conversation in the growing years just online about accessibility into public lands or really just people being able to enjoy their public lands. Um, Hold on, I just wrote my sentence. Um, One of the things that people cite as not being able to participate more in the outdoors is costs. Can we talk about um, what the cost looks like when we think about outdoor minimalism?
I'm not really understanding your question, I think.
Yeah, it's a great
Sorry.
no, can we talk so a lot of folks will say that, "Oh, getting into outdoor recreation's too expensive. I gotta get all of this stuff." Does outdoor minimalism offer, a more accessible or affordable path into outdoor recreation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I think that I came to a point of minimalism partially because of my upbringing, but also from living in a vehicle and from being nomadic and having to bounce from job to job before I decided on freelance writing as my career. And so a lot of what I've learned and what I advocate for has come from lived experience and the fact that when you are a guide in the outdoor industry, or even most people in their 20s when they're kind of coming into their own, you don't have a lot of money. And what I've often chased is those experiences. So I had to find ways to actually get out and do the things that I enjoyed. And so that came to cutting down costs in other areas, finding ways to get things at a reduced price. Maybe you're buying used or you're joining buy nothing groups. You're finding communities that want to support you in your exploration. And I think a lot of minimalism comes down to having a community because I think that's something we've really lost in our society is one third spaces where we can go and like just be without having to pay anything. And the outdoors can be that sometimes, but in a lot of instances, especially if you're trying to go to a national or state park, you have to pay to enter those spaces. So other forms of public lands like Forest Service areas or the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, those are the areas that I would frequent more often because I don't have to buy a pass to go to those places, and they offer many, many great things. Many of them have facilities in their camping areas. Camping is cheaper. They have great hiking trails or off-road trails if you're looking for that. And especially because I traveled most of the time with my dogs, it's more accessible in that arena as well. But if you're living in a metro area and you don't have a car, then how do you get to those places? So I think there's always going to be hurdles for people. You just kind of have to find a place, one where you feel welcome and accepted, and that will help give you the tools to actually get to those places, like finding someone who does have a car and who you trust and you don't feel threatened by in any capacity, and you can go out to hiking trails together. So I don't know, kind of trying to find your place can be hard in the outdoor space, especially if you didn't grow up in the outdoors, because I grew up being outside all the time. So I'm very comfortable as a single woman going out backpacking or bike packing wherever, whenever. And I know that's not true for a lot of women.
Right, and that's just something, that plays well into your story. Like you said, Minnesota farm, outside, kind of autonomous, pretty independent, self-entertained by your own books, and here you are as an adult, still running around outside, probably still self-entertained by your own books, um, and it's cool, this adult version of ourselves. You brought up PFAS and how much work you've done. Can we take a minute to talk about these forever chemicals for my audience listeners who may not be familiar?
Yeah, so I'll try to be brief on this. So PFAS is an acronym that stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is a mouthful, which is why we commonly call them forever chemicals. And they're called forever chemicals because they are extremely persistent in our environment. And essentially every PFAS molecule that's ever been created since the 50s still exists. So as we're creating more and more, the reason that we're creating them is, I guess the one that most people will be familiar with is Teflon. So that's what really kind of pushed them into the consumer market, because before that they were used for more military and like very specific manufacturing purposes. But now they're used a lot in consumer goods. So anything that is stain resistant, waterproof, stick resistant, that's not the right word, but like anti-stick, that's like the Teflon sort of material. And that's where the issues started to come to light, is from Teflon manufacturing. And so a name that people might be familiar with is Robert Bilott. He's a lawyer. He's based in Ohio, and he's the one who really kind of like brought this attention to PFAS and the dangers that are involved with them, because a farmer from West Virginia approached him and told him that his cattle were dying and they were downstream from this facility that manufactures with PFAS. And so he came, he looked at the farm, and he noticed like there was foam bubbling up on the water. The cattle had like blackened teeth and they were getting sick and they were just like dying like very rapidly. And so the more and more he looked into it, he realized it is from these chemicals. They're causing this. And there weren't really any regulations around how those chemicals were being processed, people's exposure to them if they worked in the factories, and then also how they got rid of them. So they were kind of just dumping them and they were just entering the water. And so it's about a 20-year lawsuit. It's a very long. If
Yeah.
people want to learn more about it, there's a great documentary about Robert Bilott and this process, but there is also a feature film that stars Mark Ruffalo called Dark Waters. And that's a great watch. It's very accurate to the story because Robert Bilott was involved in the production. Um, but after that lawsuit, they conducted one of the largest epidemiological studies that we've really seen in recent years on the population in that West Virginia community. I think it was over 60,000 people gave their blood to be tested, and they conclusively proved that yes, these chemicals are what were making the community sick, what were killing cattle and poisoning the water. And so now, since that is past a couple decades, we have a lot more information, but PFAS are still being used pretty aggressively across the consumer market. And so in my podcast, we cover PFAS in general as a chemical, kind of looking at the history. We talked to Robert Bilott, all those good things that people want to know about how did we get to this point. But we also talk about how they're used in the outdoor industry and how the outdoor industry kind of ignored a lot of these problems for a really long time in favor of performance instead of, I guess, what is more ethical. And one of the big players in that, of course, is W.L. Gore and Associates, which are the makers of Gore-Tex. And
Oh,
Gore-Tex, the creator of Gore-Tex, he actually came as a scientist from DuPont. And DuPont, which is now Chemours, they are the creators of Teflon. And so there's kind of like, if you follow the trajectory of the use of these chemicals, the production of these chemicals, and the pushback of regulation of these chemicals, it all kind of goes back to the same place, the same starting point, and then it kind of branched out in its use case from there. But there's tens of thousands of types of PFAS, and one of the major issues that we run into in terms of like a normal population is we don't have a lot of control over where it's being put in our makeup, in our cooking utensils, in our clothing, you know? And because of that, and because of the persistence of these chemicals, it now has contaminated all of the global water supply. And so it doesn't
ah,
really matter where you live. There's going to be higher concentrations in other areas. But essentially everyone is exposed to it now. And so everyone has some level of PFAS in their body. And it is always coming back to people wanted to make money and they knew about the consequences, but they tried to hide them for decades. And they still continue to kind of greenwash that message and try to
mm,
convince people, well, not all PFAS are bad, but in reality, they kind of are.
right. Talk to, I mean, thank you for explaining all of that. I didn't realize how far back this went, and I didn't know that it was attached to Teflon and Gore-Tex. That makes sense when you spell it out like that. Um, because, I'm over in Montana. We hear so many different things. I've heard there's just a number of things that could contaminate your farm, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I haven't thought of Gore-Tex and Teflon. I've done quite a bit of working, doing some environmental work, with, like, corporate, like, CAFOs, corporate agricultural
Mm.
feeding
Hmm.
organizations, operations, um, and talking about, livestock runoff and how do you handle that, and then, those, fertilizers and it getting into the ground soil that way. But what you're talking about is, like you said, forever chemicals that all of us have and now effectively make me. I thought by 2030 I would be an android, but apparently I'm going to be a Barbie. And here we are. Um, when you started your podcast about PFAS, um, did you feel like what? How do I want to say this? Was it more simply for awareness and educating the public, or do you also have any sort of legislation goals in mind?
I think it was more education and advocacy. It was a little bit in the zeitgeist in the outdoor industry at the time, because the timing of it is when I think AB 1817 in California was the legislation that went into effect at the beginning of 2025 that said PFAS were no longer allowed in textiles. Many of the items that the outdoor industry manufactures are like coats, backpacks, tents, they are all textiles. So they no longer could have PFAS in their materials and in their products if they wanted to sell at the market scale they wanted because California is such a large global market. And so a lot of companies were kind of scrambling at that point, and they didn't know where to go for information. They didn't know how to remove PFAS. And that's what kind of like in my mind made me mark them as like a laggard in the industry, in terms of like industries that phase PFAS out early. Because there were many industries that removed them, like the carpet industry is one example. There were a few companies, mostly in Europe, that manufacture outdoor goods, like Fjallraven and Houdini are a couple examples. Jack Wolfskin is another. But that's because the European Union has stricter regulatory rules around chemicals. So it really depended on where the company was located and what they had to do in order to continue manufacturing. And so a lot of it was kind of to keep the industry informed, but also tell average consumers, like we should be thinking about these things when we're purchasing our items because consumer pressure does help with regulatory changes, but oftentimes a company, if a company is making money selling a product and there's no regulatory change, there's no consumer pressure, oftentimes those are combined, then they're not going to change anything because they're still going to make money. And so it was kind of multiple reasons that we decided to do that. Also, I wanted to branch into more investigative sort of podcast work because the Outdoor Minimalist is we have news focused episodes and then also just like general expert conversations. So there's overlap, of course. But I felt like there were so many people in the outdoor space that they just didn't know what these things were. And it felt very important to me and very timely in terms of like where we were going as an industry.
Right. Well, and you're certainly doing that with your blog, this investigative journalism that you're talking about. I last year for the state of Montana, I helped to organize the Clean Energy Fair. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure we had a workshop on was one of your most recent blog posts when talking about clean energy, dirty tactics, because lots of folks want to switch over to renewable energy. They're looking at solar, they're looking at all these different options, but there's a lot of scams out there. Can we talk about that a little bit? About some of the scams you've seen in the solar clean energy space?
Well, are you talking about my article in Grist?
Yes.
Okay. I was like, I don't have my blog up anymore. Yeah, in
Oh, sorry.
Grist.
Yeah.
In Grist, I wrote two articles for them. One is kind of like a consumer quick look, like if a solar salesperson is approaching you, kind of what to look for. And then clean energy is kind of like a new topic, I guess, for me. I collaborated with Earth Day last year because their focus was on clean energy. And that was kind of like a jumping off interest point for me where I started to connect with more people in like the solar space, wind energy, really any form of clean energy. And my interest grew because of the current administration's push for less clean energy, essentially, like moving towards coal and really pushing for fossil fuel extraction. And there is this rhetoric, at least politically, that clean energy isn't clean. And that is just not true. There's like pros and cons to all types of industry. And it just kind of depends on how we're managing it. But there's a reason globally that we're moving to like wind and solar energy. And the United States is just kind of like backpedaling on all of that. But I guess with Grist, I went to Kansas and I did something that's called a blitz. And this is common for door-to-door salespeople, where they go into these communities and they talk to homeowners to try and get them to buy solar for their homes. And the way that the market is moving, this is really advantageous for both utilities and homeowners if it's done appropriately, because it can take some pressure off of the grid because we consume so much energy. A lot of times local utilities have a hard time keeping up. And so people are able to put it on their home. They might save some money down the line and they might be able to send some of their excess energy back to the grid. So like that all sounds really good and great. But what I saw in my experience, which is just like a small window into the world, right? There's other great articles about this. Is that many door-to-door sales people for solar are kind of overpromising or they can be manipulative. This is true in all types of sales, right? They want to make money and how they do that
Right.
is making a commission. And so the goal of that article, and when I was talking with the editor at Grist, who was great in helping me shape that, um, we just wanted to not vilify solar because there are good solar sales companies, and then there's good reason for homeowners to buy solar. But there are many red flags, such as like overselling. So like selling a larger system than you need simply because they get a larger payout, or locking people into these large loans because a lot of times you have to take out a loan to get solar, without fully understanding like the payment you're now making every month is to the loan. It's so it's not really changing your utility price. So it's just like very convoluted. It's not very well regulated. And the more reputable solar companies that do send salespeople out door to door, because it's still one of the best lead generations for them, they are pushing for regulation because a lot of these bad actors are making them look bad. And like they believe in clean energy and they want people to be able to save money and they want people to be able to move away from less sustainable forms of energy. But how can you do that when there's like this common mistrust and misunderstanding? So that was a very interesting project. I enjoyed working on it. And Grist is a great publication for listeners who are interested in the climate space. They do a lot of solutions journalism, which I think we need more of.
Yes. Yes, and I'm so excited to have an outdoor journalist. I recently read a book by by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, apparently. But he was talking about we're war now. It's not defense. But he was talking about he has a whole chapter about how climate change. I mean, we've heard this before. It's a liberal hoax. It's a money grab. Like blah blah blah. And I just, and then he spends the rest of the chapter talking about how the left is crazy, we worship climate change, and how we're going to send this country into the ground because we should be more like China. So, um, that is not accurate. These, this is. While, yes, we can have conversations about how the phrase climate change has probably shaped a lot of people applying for funding that weren't, you know what I mean? Like, climate change did become a big word, an umbrella term. So folks like you were like, well, hold on. I am like literally in this space. Um, but yes, this denial that climate change is happening and that if we do anything to protect our environment, it threatens us against China somehow. We know that China has horrendous environmental quality. We've seen these things coming out. We've seen images and videos. Um, but but can you share a little bit about why profit driven? Yeah. About why, yeah, China is a concern, but we need to live here. We need to be here and drinking from that. So talk to me. You said a lot of environmental regulations have been pulled back um, here in the United States under this administration. What are one or two of those policies that have been pulled back in the name of capitalism that just, broke your heart?
Well, I mean, there's like a push and pull happening. So I guess if we want to stick with the clean energy sort of thing, they removed all of the contracts and like leases that were on public lands for clean energy projects. So that includes like wind and solar, some geothermal, but they're like kind of still doing some of those projects in favor of oil and mineral leasing. So I think in 2025, we saw an increase of over 50% in terms of permits approved on public lands for oil and gas leasing. That doesn't mean that they're going and breaking ground immediately. It's not to scare people. It just means like there is this move towards industry that's very reminiscent of the Gilded Age. And that's showing up in kind of our class discrepancy as well. So there are these class wars happening, and there's a huge wealth gap. And that's only being exacerbated by the administration propping up industry, no matter what the industry is. We see that on public lands, like very aggressively with the mineral extraction. We saw it recently when we entered Venezuela, because that was because of oil. Same with the discussions with Greenland. That's because of oil. And so that would probably be the most alarming because it is the most threatening to our climate. So that's why the world is upset with the United States. I mean, there's many reasons to be upset with the United States, but I think the most pressing reason is that if we are moving in this direction towards increased fossil fuel extraction and increased dependence on fossil fuels, we are setting the world on fire, and it's the United States doing that. And I think that a lot of people might not agree with me, but I tend to take a strong stance on things, for better or worse. And I do think that that's the most alarming thing. And when it comes to climate change, like you said, that phrase is not always well accepted, especially in smaller communities or like redder areas. But oftentimes, if you remove that phrase completely from the conversation and you talk about the issues, the people are having the farmers are having the same issues, the ranchers are having the same issues. It's just they don't call it climate change. And so, like, finding ways to connect with people that aren't using this language that alienates them is very helpful because of the level of propaganda that we're seeing from this administration and that people are buying into. It's very unfortunate. Um,
I'm so glad you brought that up. That language is important. And for people like you, like you're like, I just want to communicate the problem. Like I don't want to get in some political thing right now. I just want to talk. So um language is political. So when you find yourself in different spaces, do you change your language? Do you have a sort of different way of speaking, or do you just steamroll and do what you're gonna do?
I think a past version of myself would steamroll. But knowing what I know now, and like being in so many different spaces culturally in the United States, I've learned like ways to talk around it. Like instead of saying climate change, I talk about weather patterns and like try to relate to people and being like, it's been exceptionally wet or exceptionally dry, and like what are the weather pattern changes that you're seeing, and then like helping people kind of like draw those connections without making them feel like they're being attacked, because I think a lot of times when we're using terms like climate change in certain arenas, people feel like immediately like a red flag goes up and they're like, well, that's not real. Well, it's not my fault or something like that. They feel like they have to defend it for some reason. Um, but even outside of those like more rural spaces in the outdoor industry and in other media arenas, we're seeing people shy away from that, whether if I'm going to stick in the outdoor space, since that's mostly what I interact with, even brands. Like at the beginning of the second Trump administration, there were brands changing their language on their website revolving around sustainability and inclusivity. Right. They're removing language around climate change because they don't want to get flagged by the administration. And that is censorship. We're seeing censorship across the board. And um, if people want to read one really short, easy book by Timothy Snyder on tyranny, there's a chapter on complying in advance, and we saw a lot of that. And we're still seeing it in the outdoor industry, especially with large media conglomerates like Outside Magazine is now run by essentially a tech tycoon, someone who doesn't really have the interests of the people in mind, but profit in mind. And so a lot of times, like I have moved away from kind of like working with publications like that and more so go to nonprofit newsrooms like ProPublica, Grist. There's a new one in the outdoor space that was the old editor in chief of Outside Magazine called Republic. Chris Keyes is the founder of that, or one of the founders of that. And they cover public lands in depth with some like on the ground reporting, investigative journalism. It's pretty new, but it's filled with kind of the old guard of outdoor coverage and like outdoor journalism. And I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole right now, but censorship is such a big problem across the world and across the country. But we're seeing that enter spaces when we're talking about climate, and it makes it very difficult to then really get your work published. And as someone who wants to tell the truth, get it published in a way that it's not being stripped of everything that is meant to be told.
Yes. Right. And like you said, the censorship and then environment will always be political, right? Like anytime there is a disturbance to the warfare is a detriment. I mean, look at Gaza. I mean, I don't even want to think about what's going on in the ground table in the water and like it just oh I I had the opportunity last year. I know that you are currently based in Arizona for the time. Last fall, I had the opportunity to go with a group of theologians and ministers to the border and learn about all the different immigration issues. And one of the things that they talked about that we had an opportunity to meet with were different indigenous groups whose lands spread the border. And they were talking about how the border wall and increased policing has made it difficult for indigenous people to access different parts of their own reservation. Um, Talking about how the border wall has been just absolutely horrendous for wildlife migration and just different issues, and you're sitting there, and that's just not something people think about, when this administration gets online and starts blaming immigrants for everything, you don't think, "Well, oh, we're gonna build a wall, and then random deer and wildlife and indigenous people are gonna be affected by that." There's just so many different stories to tell when talking about environment, and so um, it's, uh it's political. It's political, folks.
It's always
There
political,
It's always political.
always political. And public lands are being more and more politicized. I mean, you're talking about the border wall. And one thing that I have been trying to talk more about is how um, Doug Burgum and like the Department of Interior, they're kind of trying to militarize those public lands, especially on the border. And that's problematic because of what you're saying, as well as just like general access to those areas. There's no oversight in terms of the impact, especially if it's a sacred site or in the desert, it's extremely fragile ecosystems. And so if the military is given full control over hundreds of acres of land along the border, one, you have no idea what they're doing in there to people. And you also have no idea what they're doing to land. So that's problematic. I mean, we see that disregard for indigenous populations across the board on public lands with alligator Alcatraz and the Miccosukee tribe down there. They're the main advocates against that concentration camp. So, but they're also the ones being pushed out. So there's just constant battles being fought across the country, but they are all very related.
Yes. Right. They're absolutely related, and I know for me last year, was it February, March? When they made the announcement that the head of the Forest Services was coming from the logging industry, I mean, I didn't even know what to it was I read that and just walked around in a daze. And so we're seeing, like you said, this administration prioritize profit, um, and bypass, leaders with expertise like you, bypassing local communities like the indigenous, and and just scraping and scalping the earth of everything they can get. And then, of course, they blame it all on China. If we don't do this here, China's gonna, it's China, and it's just this constant narrative of we need to take from everything.
Well,
Um,
fear is a powerful motivator. And if you can instill fear in the general population, you can get them to do a lot of things and believe in a lot of things, whether or not they're true.
and I think that's why I like your work so much because you're a very calm demeanor, right? You're not running around saying like screaming, and you just have this. Let's just explain and arm people with the facts. So thank you for your service. How can my audience find you? How can they support you? Yeah, show them where they can go.
The best place is on podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, if you still subscribe to them, really any podcast platform. We're also on YouTube. You can look up Outdoor Minimalists. You can find us. I have a weekly newsletter based off of theoutdoorminimalist.com. And then I'm also on TikTok, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Would be the next most active ones. I'd say we're most active if you want to stay up to date on public lands content on Instagram, kind of shying a little bit away from TikTok because we're a small team, just 3 people. So it's hard to be on all the platforms.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it is. Folks, you get carney.com. You have Outdoor Minimalist on the handle. You have the podcast. Man, thank you for joining us. Meg, you are such a light, and it's been a hard week for me personally. So just being and hearing you, I'm like, okay, yeah, there are good people that are doing this thing. I hope that you'll consider joining us again. Is there any last remarks that you would like to share with the public before we wrap up?
Well, just thanks for having me. It was really great to connect. I hope that we can connect in the future, and I'm sure a lot of our topics kind of overlap. So always open to other collaborations. I think, like I mentioned earlier, that community is something that we really need right now, whether that is online or in person. So I always love connecting with like-minded individuals or people, not even like-minded, but just like people who have a good heart and they want the world to be a better place.
Thank you. And back at you. Yes. And we don't have to be like-minded. We just have to have good hearts and we'll figure it out. Like we'll do it. But folks, thank you for joining us for another week of Follow the Leader. I am your host, Lee, and this was Meg Carney of the Outdoor Minimalist. You can check her out in the links and information below. Other than that, y'all take care, and I will see you next time on Follow the Leader. Bye-bye. And